You're listening to State of Truth AM. If you're a new listener, please say...
Are you a tenured dog or captain?
How can there be no order? You are Klaus Hendricks. You went to Munich University. I don't know what the
We were wrong. Hello everyone, my name is Professor Scalar and welcome to the lore video that many of you have been waiting almost a year and a half for. Over this past year, 10 Chambers has been bringing back all the old rundowns as alternate versions, where things were very similar to how they used to be before, but also a bit different. Throughout these alternate rundowns were scattered a plethora of lore logs, some returning ones from before, and others being brand new. Along with all these logs though, came something unexpected, a misconception that quickly spread throughout the community. And before we can go any further today, we need to clear up this misconception, else your perspective of the game's lore remain corrupted. So what is this misconception I speak of? Well, it's the idea that the alternate rundowns and their logs were being used to rewrite the story of GTFO and trivialize almost everything from the original rundowns. Due to many of the returning logs being almost identical to their original counterparts, a lot of players assumed most of these logs were simply the old deleted ones coming back to allow newer players to see them. But when they looked at some of the other logs, it seemed almost as if contradictions were forming. Events weren't transpiring at the same point as before, certain people had almost completely different mannerisms, information just wasn't aligning properly. And because of this, the misconception on how GTFO's story was being rewritten started to spread. But after spending hours digging through all of the current lore, cross-examining original and alternate logs, and looking for answers, I finally came to the realization that the game's story wasn't being rewritten. The logs from the original rundowns and the alternate rundowns are both part of GTFO's story. They are similar because they share the same skeletal frame, but they are different because they're not from the same timeline. Or rather, should I say, they're not from the same dimension. Even though it looks like we're trapped in the same complex as before, completing the same task as before, and dealing even with the same enemies as before, we are not in the same dimension as we were for the original first 7 rundowns. The alternate rundowns all take place in a second dimension, and there's plenty of evidence to back this theory up. One of the big things players looked at when they thought the lore was being redone was our good old friend Schaefer, which if you don't know much about John Schaefer, I highly recommend you go watch my lore video on the guy as he is a very important person in GTFO. Throughout the original rundowns, Schaefer left behind many audio logs for us to listen to, and by listening to these logs, you can tell he was very, well...
Yes, I know. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. I can't hear you down here. Fuck them! Fuck the warden!
Yeah, not all that stable. We also learn that he doesn't like the warden all that much, since on multiple occasions, he tells us that we need to rebel against the warden and that it is to never ever be trusted. In the alternate rundowns though, he's quite a bit different.
It's like I was always here, but it used to be different. I know things, but I don't know how I know them. I can operate machinery, well, like this recorder, but I don't know how I know. That's my first objective. Objective. That word again. My first task is to figure out where I am and why I'm here and who the others are.
As you can tell, he's a lot more calm and collected. He also doesn't have a burning hatred for the Warden, rather a curiosity as to what it is and why the Warden is doing what it's doing. He even eventually tells us in alternate rundown 6 that we need to work with the Warden as it's on our side. This major change in mannerism was one of the founding arguments for the misconception, but the existence of Rundown 7 itself is a massive contradiction to this line of thought. If 10 Chambers truly was remaking the lore and changing Schaefer to fit their new design, they would have had to change the dialogue throughout Rundown 7, because throughout that rundown, we don't see calm, collected, and open-minded Schaefer. We see...
Why not? What's a proxy?
How am I supposed to explain this to you? I don't even know where I'm getting all this shit from. And why is it I still can't remember?
The Warden fucked you, not me.
Do they remember? No? Yes? I don't know.
And he still has a hatred towards the Warden. This clearly shows us that the Schaefer from the original rundowns and the one from the alternate rundowns are not one and the same. And they can't be rewriting the lore of the game to make things more consistent if they haven't even touched Rundown 7 to fix the inconsistencies that exist there. Which, if 10 Chambers was going to change the dialogue in Rundown 7, they would have done so already. Another piece of evidence are the lore logs themselves. As I stated earlier, nearly every single log that returned from the original rundowns has been modified in some way or another. Take a look at this log from the original R4C1. It's nothing special, just a simple log of an inventory check on some goods that a KDS representative received. But now, take a look at the same log from alternate R4C1. As you can see, it's similar to the original, but some details have been altered. The exact amount of some of the items on the list is not the same between the two logs, and even the location at which the goods were received is slightly different. Once again, if GTFO's story was being remade, there's no reason that something as minute as this log should be altered. The log doesn't tie in anywhere else in the story of GTFO. There isn't a section of a level where you can actually see all the goods being stored away. There's no other log that branches off from this one. It stands completely on its own and wouldn't need to be altered whatsoever to fit some new story they were creating. Rather, this log shows more evidence towards the idea that they're actually making a new alternate timeline, and that these rundowns, these levels, and their logs are not just simply there to replace the old story, but they're a new story that's running parallel with the one we've come to know for so long. Now, of course, we can't just pull the multi-dimension idea out of a hat and think it's just gonna fit right on in. We have to have evidence to support this wacky theory, which, of course, we have plenty of, otherwise I wouldn't have bothered mentioning the concept in the first place. Throughout Rundown 6, we worked with something called the Matter Wave Projector. This item of unknown origin being capable of teleporting us to unknown locations. And the Matter Wave wasn't only a gameplay mechanic, it was also part of the lore. Across multiple logs, we see and hear about people suddenly vanishing without a single trace whenever they touch the Matter Wave or items of a similar origin. Researchers did a lot of testing with these mysterious artifacts, and learned that some of them could be utilized with the Matter Wave projector to teleport people to more precise locations. However, they still had no clue where those people would actually end up at. But like all things in the name of science, they had to know more. From this, Project Insight was formed as a part of the work staff down in the complex. Insight did multiple test runs, transmatting personnel and things like supplies and plant life to see what they could learn from this. And their knowledge later on became our own. In a log from R7B3, someone by the name of Dr. Stokes talks about data gathered from when they transmitted the EF01 group. The data completely baffled her though, as it showed that Dr. Durant and his team, who were part of that expedition, weren't sent to a different place on Earth, but a brand new dimension. In that dimension, 1 second for us was the equivalent of 85 seconds for them. Their time moved a whole lot faster than ours. We also received a log from alternate R1B1 talking about how a security officer mask was jammed under the launch platform for the EF-01 launch. The mask was a different design from the usual, but it was covered in Bishop's DNA, the only operative who mysteriously returned one day from that expedition. When asked about it though, it was stated that Bishop already had all the equipment that was given to him beforehand, and therefore the mask did not belong to him. Almost sounds as if that mask didn't belong to that Bishop, but perhaps a Bishop from a different dimension. And if all of this still isn't enough to convince you that alternate dimensions is a more than realistic possibility in GTFO, then just take a look at a certain Rundown 6 level. I'm not going to specify which one it is to avoid spoiling it for anyone who hasn't played the mission yet, but in that level, the concept of alternate dimensions is quite literally thrown right into your face multiple times. With all this evidence and all that being said, we can more than safely assume that 10 Chambers isn't hitting the big red undo button on the lore they've built up over the past few years. Instead, there are two main stories being told, one through the original 7 rundowns and one through the 6 alternate rundowns. And while these stories have their similarities, there are also plenty of differences which we'll need to have a good comprehension of before we can possibly begin to imagine what might be waiting for us in the final chapter, Rundown 8. When it comes to both timelines, there's a lot of information we could cover. So much that doing so today would divert us away from our main focus. Hence why I'll be giving a simple overview of the parts that aren't quite as relevant and going into greater detail of the parts that are. The two timelines have very similar origins. In the year of 2049, the Santonium Mining Company gained access to the Chicxulub crater area where they planned to create a giant underground mining facility to reach a massive deposit of iridium that would be worth approximately $300 billion. Now, while the complex known as Garganta was being constructed, a lot of different events transpired, most of which though we're not going to cover. Fast forward a few years later though to the year of 2052, and we get to the point where things start becoming problematic. As the company continued to delve deeper into the earth to uncover not only that iridium, but other treasures and artifacts that they came across, something known as the NOM-V virus started to spread. At first, the company tried to treat it as nothing more than a simple sickness, stating that the virus posed very little threat to anyone and people should just continue on with their work. But this couldn't be any further from the truth. Very rapidly, the virus spread throughout Garganta and was killing people left and right. For a while though, NOM-V was only an issue down in the complex. But eventually, it made its way to the outside world. In alternate R5B2, we find an audio log recorded by someone named Matthew Aaron. In the recording, he states the date is June 12, 2057, and that they finally found the origination of the NOM-V virus. The carrier was a Santonium Mining Company employee who fled Garganta on December 28, 2052. They then made their way to Florida, where the virus rapidly spread and it got to the point where the CDC, Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, first issued an alert on January 11, 2053. It was from this point that the virus started to spread worldwide. On March 14, 2053, the virus made its way to England and was declared a Phase 6 global pandemic by the World Health Organization. And by September of 2055, there were 4.8 billion confirmed cases of NOM-V and 2.7 billion confirmed deaths from the virus. Very quickly, humanity was going extinct because of NOM-V. Meanwhile, inside the complex, our friend Schaefer started to get busy. And this is where the two timelines start to noticeably differentiate. In the original rundowns, Schaefer freed himself from his programming and tried to find a way to escape to the surface. Confused and paranoid, he assumed everyone was against him, and that the Warden was to never, ever be trusted. After a while though, he learned that he couldn't escape on his own, so he looked towards us. He knew we were still stuck in the Legion program and were obedient workers for the Warden, but he had no other choice. So he started leaving recordings behind for us, talking to us about who he was and how we need to start thinking for ourselves. The Warden was our enemy, and we needed to break free, free other prisoners, start a revolution, and take back our lives. While this was all going on though, Schaefer crossed paths with something weird. It wasn't another prisoner like us, and it wasn't one of those creatures. It was something else, almost human-like, but not quite right. Something we'll refer to as the specimen. For a while, Schaefer watched the specimen from a distance, monitoring its actions. The specimen walked among the sleepers, almost as if it was invisible to them, calling out to anyone who might respond. And at one point, Schaefer approached the specimen, but due to the way the thing talked, Schaefer didn't really learn much from it. Instead, he ran away confused and scared. Once Schaefer was far away enough from the specimen and was completely out of danger, he recounted the experience and grew frustrated with himself, annoyed that he ran away in fear, and therefore determined that the next encounter with the specimen, he wouldn't let himself be overcome. He also determined that since the specimen mentioned the Warden, it must have been a trick sent by the Warden to deceive him. Therefore, the specimen was an enemy and needed to be killed. During Schaefer's next encounter with the specimen, he stayed true to himself, and despite the pleading cries of it, Schaefer beat the specimen to death. And with it gone, Schaefer's attention turned back towards us and escaping from the complex. As we progressed through the rundowns, Schaefer communicated with us more often and even had us assist him with some tasks in Rundown 7. Eventually, he freed another prisoner by the name of Henriksen, an engineer, and they worked together to find a way to gain control. After a few more missions, Henriksen developed a memory stick with a virus on it that would give them control over the biocom system, which had access to nearly everything down in the complex. All that was needed was for us to break our way into the mainframe and insert the memory stick, and once that was done, we would then need to reboot the system via the nearby reactor, and assuming everything worked out according to plan, we would finally have control of pretty much everything. And that's exactly what we did in the last two missions of Rundown 7, although we barely made it out in one piece. And with that, we've reached the current ending of the first timeline. Moving on to the second timeline, things are fairly identical until our man Schaefer comes into play. As stated earlier, this Schaefer was far more calm and collected. His goal wasn't necessarily to escape from the complex, but to learn more about the bigger picture and figure out exactly what's going on. With this different mindset, he makes his way through the complex, reading and listening to the logs left behind by former employees and learning more about the Warden itself. Eventually, Schaefer leaves behind a recording on his findings and explains that the Warden is using a subroutine called Conduit. Conduit's goal is to communicate with the prisoners, but every time so far it's either been killed by the prisoners themselves or by the creatures. Still confused as to what the Warden's goal was, Schaefer continued exploring through the complex looking for answers, and eventually he stumbled across some. Schaefer learned that Kovac had a cloning program called Rise, their purpose to mass-produce soldiers instead of just using recruits. And while not perfected, Rise was capable of producing living specimens, and not much later, Schaefer came across one of these specimens. It was surrounded by creatures, but none of the creatures attacked it. Then a group of prisoners came through a security door, and all those creatures decided it was time to attack. A fight broke out, which resulted in the deaths of all of the creatures, two of the prisoners, and the specimen itself. Schaefer realized though that the specimen wasn't trying to actually attack the prisoners. It was trying to communicate with them right before the fight broke out. And he decided that he would try to talk with a specimen if he happened to come across one, which he had a good feeling that he would, as he knew the subroutine program that the warden had going would be sending another one not too long from then. And after an unknown amount of time, Schaefer's patience was rewarded. The log you see on screen is by far one of, if not the most important piece of lore that we received in all 6 of the alternate rundowns. In their conversation, the specimen explains that the warden is part of them, and that they have traveled across multiple dimensions collecting the virus. But they had concluded that the collection could not be completed. In any dimension that the virus was present, it was the primary life force. At the current rate, everything in these dimensions would be affected by the virus and die. Schaefer tried to claim that people outside the complex surely had to be working on a cure, and that there was still hope in the current dimension. But the specimen replied that 96.35% of the humans in this dimension were already infected by the virus. The few pure ones who still remained would have to leave. When asked how, the specimen explained that a new dimension would be determined. Humans would then project themselves to the new dimension and destroy the projector so that the impurity wouldn't be able to follow them. Before the specimen could say much more though, it started to fail. But before it fully died, it stated that the warden would open some files for Schaefer so that he and others could learn more and find a way to save the last bit of humanity. Towards the end of Alternate Rundown 6, Schaefer finally reaches out to us and briefly explains what's going on. He explains that there is nothing for us outside of the complex because of the virus, and that we need to work with the warden, not against him, in order for humanity to continue on. For the time being though, we just needed to survive, continue completing tasks for the warden, and Schaefer would contact us again later on once he works out a plan. And thus ends the current story of the second timeline. 2 different timelines, both relevant to the plot of GTFO. In the first one, we're more than likely doomed unless Schaefer and Henriksen somehow come to learn the truth before it's too late. In the second one, it seems we've got a better chance of survival, but there are still many uncertainties and dangers we'll have to survive before we're finally in the clear. But now we're left to wonder what's going to happen in Rundown 8. Well, 10 Chambers notified the community a while ago that Rundown 8 will conclude the current storyline of Dada, Hackett, Bishop, and Woods, and would be the climatic finale they've been building towards with the alternate rundowns, which tells us that the alternate timeline has to have some play in Rundown 8. But what about the original timeline? Well, since we've shown that the alternate rundowns weren't a tool to rewrite the story of the game and that the old lore is still 100% relevant, it's safe to believe that the original timeline will also take part in Rundown 8. Which means this single rundown is going to somehow bring the 2 timelines together and conclude the story from each of them. How they're going to go about doing that though, well, that is something we can only speculate on. After thinking on it for a while, I see Rundown 8 playing out one of 2 different ways. The first possibility is that the levels in the rundown will be divided. Some of the missions will be part of the first timeline, and other missions will be part of the alternate timeline. This way both stories are concluded and everything is wrapped up in that rundown. 2 separate endings. Although if this is how 10 Chambers goes about it, then hopefully they make it somewhat clear early on in the rundown. Otherwise, I can see a lot of players, especially newer ones who didn't play the original rundowns, becoming incredibly confused as to why Rundown 8 is designed like that. The second possibility though is that Rundown 8 will continue from where we left off in Rundown 7, the original timeline. In one or some of the missions, we'll do some dimension jumping, either on purpose or by accident, and we'll come into contact with the alternate dimension. While there, we might either come across some logs or maybe even encounter alternate Schaefer or ourselves, and then we'll learn from them the truth about the outside world. Upon warping back to our main dimension, we'll then either try to convince our Schaefer and Henriksen that we need to stop our current plan and work with the Warden, which I guarantee won't go over well with how Schaefer views the Warden, or we'll have to make a decision towards the end of the rundown. We either follow through with the original plan to escape to the surface, knowing full well that it'll be the death of our dimension, or we defy Schaefer and Henriksen and set up a warp gate to permanently escape from our current dimension to one that is free of the Nam-V virus. And something like this can actually be accomplished fairly well with the use of optional objectives. Assuming Rundown 8 has an E tier mission, which it's the final rundown of the game, so there's no way in heck we wouldn't be getting an R8E1, the level could have 1 or even 2 optional objectives in it. If we stick to just the main objective, that'll result in the, quote, bad ending where we stick to the original plan and escape to the surface. But if we risk our lives and take some extra steps in doing the optional objectives, we'll set up a warp gate to a safe dimension and save some fellow prisoners who are clean of the Nam-V virus, resulting in the, quote, good ending. Now, both of these theories are just that. Possibilities, not certainties. All of this stemmed from information that's currently in the game and my own creativity. And as we've seen before with previous theories of mine, sometimes I'm actually fairly close to the truth, and other times I'm in a completely different zip code. But one other speculation I'd like to share about Rundown 8 before I wrap up this video is about what's going to happen to our main cast. After being with this game for a few years now, I've come to learn that 10 Chambers is very meticulous with their wording. They hate making promises that they don't know if they'll be able to keep, and they're even cautious about stating possibilities unless they make it clear that by no means are they guaranteeing it'll happen. So when 10 Chambers stated, and I quote, Rundown 8.0 will conclude the current storyline of Dada, Hackett, Bishop, and Woods that started way back in December 2019, end quote, the gears in my head started turning. Why specify the storyline of the 4 characters when they could have said the story of GTFO? I speculated that this could be a non-promise indirect hint that at some point down the road, 10 Chambers might revisit GTFO and make either a second game or just simply more rundowns that tell a new story through the perspective of a different cast. But if they revisit the game, why do it with a new cast? You'd assume we continue playing as our 4 beloved characters unless something happens to them in Rundown 8. If we do end up leaving the complex and making it to the surface, our characters are basically all but dead because of the Nam virus. But I have a feeling that escaping to a clean dimension is more than likely the route the story will take, which means our characters shouldn't die, right? Well, I have a sneaking suspicion that GTFO's ending isn't going to be all sunshine and rainbows for us. As the specimen told the alternate Schaefer, if we project to a new dimension, we have to destroy the projector, otherwise the creatures, and therefore the virus, might follow us. Something that can't be done once we're on the other side. Somebody is going to have to stay behind to ensure that the virus can't follow. And seeing how we're going to be the ones who have to more than likely clear out hordes of sleepers to make a safe passage for the others, we're not going to be clean of that virus. We're constantly getting reinfected during our expeditions, only surviving this long because getting back into our hydrostasis units effectively kills us along with the virus. And since we'll be carriers of the virus right at the end of Rundown 8, we can't escape with everyone else. Just quickly running back and getting to hydrostasis units and then just having other people take us with them over through that warp gate into the new dimension more than likely won't be a luxury we can afford. We're going to be sending everybody through, and then our final objective, the last mission we'll be receiving might be to stay behind, destroy the projector once everyone else makes it safely through, and then end our own lives before we succumb to the virus or to the sleepers. And there you have it. The story of the original and alternate rundowns and how it all might tie together in the finale, Rundown 8. I made you all wait a very long time for this lore video, but I hope that the wait was more than worth it. Had it not been for the information given in Alternate Rundown 6, we never would have learned that all this time, we've been going about the story incorrectly. And while we are still meant to GTFO, the surface isn't our final destination, but rather a safe haven where we can finally be free of the NOM-V virus. As always though, thank you for watching this video. I hope that not only was it eye-opening for you all, but also enjoyable to sit through. If it was, then please consider hitting that like button, as it does help out the channel and it helps these videos get noticed by others who are also interested in the convoluted story behind GTFO. I don't know how long it'll be after Rundown 8's release that I'll get around to making another lore video. More than likely it won't be for quite a while though, but perhaps this one is enough to satiate your hunger for the time being, and I won't have to worry about people asking me when... No, it can't be already. But I just, you just, what?